The red against the white was the first thing Silas Blackwood noticed. It was a wound in the landscape, a smear of impossible color against the featureless expanse of snow that stretched from his porch to the distant teeth of the mountains. He had been splitting wood, the rhythmic thump of his axe the only sound besides the low moan of the wind, when his dog, Gunner, let out a low growl. The German shepherd stood stiff, hackles raised, his gaze fixed on the road. Silas followed the dog's line of sight. It was not a wound. It was a person, a small figure moving with a staggering, exhausted gait. The red was a dress, silk by the look of it, entirely wrong for the brutal cold of a Montana winter. As the figure drew nearer, details sharpened into a horrifying picture. It was a woman, her black hair coming loose from an elaborate pin, her face pale with more than just the cold. She wore thin slippers, now soaked and useless, on her feet. She was Chinese, dressed in the finery of a bride, and she was utterly, desperately alone. Silas set his axe down. This was trouble. Trouble of a kind he had spent his life avoiding. He lived alone, worked his small cattle ranch alone, and found a quiet satisfaction in the solitude. But the woman stumbled again, catching herself on a fence post, and a wave of something that felt like shame washed over him. To see this and do nothing was a kind of cruelty the landscape itself would not forgive. He whistled sharply. Gunner looked back at him, questioning. "Easy, boy," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. He started walking toward the road, his boots crunching in the hard-packed snow. The woman saw him coming and froze, her body tensing like a cornered animal. There was fear in her eyes, but beneath it, something else. A profound, bone-deep humiliation that was harder to look at than any injury. He started, holding his hands up, palms open. The wind snatched the word and tore it to shreds. He moved closer, until he was only a few feet away. The cold was a physical thing, a predator. He could see her shivering, a tremor that shook her whole frame. She was not long for this world out here. He looked from her exhausted face to the darkening sky. Another storm was coming. "Get into my cabin," he said, his words firm but not unkind. "It's freezing outside," he gestured with his head toward the small, sturdy building behind him, a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. She did not move. She just stared at him, her dark eyes wide and unreadable. He could see the calculations happening within them, weighing the danger of a stranger against the certainty of the cold. "Please," he said, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "You'll die out here." For a long moment, she remained perfectly still. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod that seemed to cost her the last of her strength, she took a hesitant step toward him, and then another. Gunner, who had trotted up beside Silas, did not bark. He whined softly and nudged her hand with his nose. The woman flinched, then looked down at the dog. A single tear traced a path down her frozen cheek before she looked back at Silas. The look in her eyes was no longer just fear. It was a question, one he had no answer for. He simply turned and led the way, the red of her dress a silent accusation following him through the snow. Inside, the heat from the pot-bellied stove was a heavy blanket. The woman, who had not yet spoken a word, stood just inside the door as if she might need to flee at a moment's notice. Silas ignored her for a minute, stoking the fire and adding another log. The scent of pine and coffee filled the small, one-room cabin. It was a simple space, clean and orderly. A bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs in the center, shelves of tinned goods and books lining one wall. "There's a stew on the stove," he said without turning around. "And coffee. Sit down before you fall down." He pointed to one of the chairs. She moved toward it with a stiff grace, her wet slippers making soft, squelching sounds on the wooden floorboards. He pulled a heavy wool blanket from his own bed and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at his touch but clutched the rough fabric as if it were a lifeline. He saw her hands then. They were slender and pale, but the nails were short and clean, the fingers surprisingly strong-looking. Not the hands of a woman who had known only leisure. He poured coffee into a tin mug and slid it across the table to her. She wrapped her hands around it, letting the warmth soak in. He took the other chair, watching her over the rim of his own mug. He needed to know what had happened, but pressing her would do no good. "My name is Silas Blackwood," he said quietly. She looked up, her eyes finally focusing on him. "Leanne," she whispered, her voice hoarse. It was the first word she had spoken. "Leanne," he repeated. "You're a long way from anywhere." She gave a small, bitter smile that did not reach her eyes. "I was to be married." The words hung in the air. He had heard the talk in Covenant Creek, the nearest town, some 20 miles east. A merchant, Jasper Sterling, had arranged for a bride to be brought from California. Sterling was a man who liked to display his wealth, and a foreign bride in a silk dress was just another acquisition, like his polished carriage or the gold watch chain stretched across his waistcoat. "Sterling," Silas stated. It was not a question. Leanne's hands tightened on her mug. She nodded once, her gaze dropping to the table. He said the goods were not as described. Her English was careful, accented, but clear. The phrase was obviously one she was repeating, a barb that had lodged deep. "He put me out. On the road. He said the walk back to the rail spur would be good for my character." Silas felt a cold anger settle in his gut. The rail spur was 50 miles away. It was a death sentence. Sterling had not just abandoned her, he had murdered her and trusted the winter to hide the body. The public nature of it, the calculated cruelty, was what galled him most. Sterling had made a spectacle of her arrival, and then an even greater one of her dismissal. "He is not a good man," Silas said, the understatement thick in the air. Leanne looked up, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear or shame in her eyes. It was a flash of steel, a glint of hard, unbending pride. "He is a fool," she said, her voice gaining a measure of strength. "He thought I was a decoration. He did not understand what I brought." Before Silas could ask what she meant, a fresh gust of wind rattled the windowpane, and a new wave of snow began to fall, thick and fast. The storm was setting in. They were trapped, the two of them and the dog, in this small cabin, with the fool's dangerous pride festering 20 miles away in town. What she brought did not matter now. What Sterling might do next, however, was a problem that was only just beginning. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world of pristine, sculpted white under a painfully bright sun. The reprieve was temporary, the sky to the north was already the color of a bruise. Silas knew he needed supplies. The unexpected guest meant his winter stores would run thin faster, and another, bigger storm meant he might not get another chance to travel for weeks. Covenant Creek was the only option. "I have to go to town," he told Leanne. She was sitting at the table, wearing a spare wool shirt of his that swallowed her small frame, mending the hem of her ruined silk dress with a needle and thread from his kit. The act was one of quiet defiance. She was not discarding the symbol of her humiliation, she was repairing it. "Town is not safe for you," she said, not looking up from her work. "For me. It's not safe for you here, either, if we run out of food," he countered. "I'll be careful. No one needs to know you're here." She finally paused, her needle held mid-stitch. "People in small towns always know," she said, her voice flat. "They will see you buy too much flour. They will see you look for things a man alone does not buy." She was right, of course. He was a creature of habit. His purchases at the general store were predictable. Any deviation would be noted and discussed before he was even halfway home. But there was no choice. "Stay inside. Keep the door barred. Gunner will stay with you," he instructed. "He won't let anyone near the cabin that I haven't brought myself." She nodded, her eyes following him as he pulled on his heavy coat and boots. As he reached for the door, she spoke again. "Mr. Blackwood." "Silas." He turned. "Be watchful of Mr. Sterling," she said. "He is a man who hates to be made a fool of. And he believes I have made him 1 inch." The ride to Covenant Creek was cold and slow. The snow was deep, forcing his horse, Arjux, to labor. The town, when he finally reached it, was quiet, huddled under a blanket of white. Chimney smoke rose in straight lines into the still, frigid air. He tied Arjux to the hitching post outside the general store and took a deep breath before going in. The store was warm and smelled of cinnamon, leather, and dried apples. Mr. Albright, the proprietor, gave him a friendly nod from behind the counter. A few other men, ranchers, and townsfolk were gathered around the stove, nursing cups of coffee. The conversation stopped the moment he walked in. "Silas," Albright said. "Didn't expect to see you with a big blow coming in." "Running low on coffee and flour," Silas said, keeping his voice even. He moved through the aisles, gathering what he needed, acutely aware of the eyes on his back. He added an extra bag of beans, a larger sack of flour than usual, and, after a moment's hesitation, a small tin of tea. It was the tea that did it. "Getting fancy in your old age, Silas," one of the men by the stove called out. It was a man named Peterson, who worked for Sterling. Before Silas could answer, the door opened and Jasper Sterling himself walked in. He was dressed in a fine wool coat with a fur collar, his face pink from the cold. He radiated an aura of smug satisfaction. His eye scanned the room and settled on Silas. "Blackwood," Sterling said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Braving the elements, I see. A man of your simple means must find this weather particularly trying." Silas said nothing, just moved to the counter to pay for his goods. Sterling followed him, his presence a heavy weight in the small space. "I heard you had some excitement out your way yesterday," Sterling continued, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some lost cargo, I believe. I trust it froze solid before it could wander onto your property and cause a nuisance." The room went silent. Everyone knew what he was talking about. They were all watching, waiting to see what Silas would do. He could feel Leanne's warning in the back of his mind. He placed his coins on the counter, his movements deliberate. "The only nuisance I saw on the road yesterday, Sterling," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous, "was the memory of a man who'd mistake a person for a piece of cargo." A collective intake of breath came from the men at the stove. Sterling's smile tightened. His face went from pink to a blotchy red. He had expected Silas to cower, to mumble something and leave. He had not expected a direct challenge. "You do well to mind your own business, rancher," Sterling hissed. "Some things are best left where you find them. Especially damaged goods." Silas finished packing his supplies into a burlap sack. He turned to face Sterling, meeting his furious gaze without flinching. "I always do," he said calmly. "And I've always found that a thing's true value isn't what you pay for it. It's what it can do." He turned and walked out of the store, the silence he left behind as heavy as a burial shroud. He did not yet know that the deed in Sterling's pocket was not the only thing he was hiding. As he mounted Arjux, he caught the eye of the town sheriff, who was standing across the street. The sheriff's face was a blank mask, but his eyes were cold. He had made his choice. He was Sterling's man. Silas nudged Arjux into a trot, heading home. He had bought more than just supplies in that store. He had bought himself a feud. The journey back was fraught with a new kind of tension. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every snap of a frozen branch sounded like a rifle shot. He had publicly shamed Jasper Sterling, a man whose ego was as vast and fragile as a pane of ice. Men like Sterling did not forgive such slights. They retaliated. When he finally saw the plume of smoke from his cabin, a knot of anxiety in his chest loosened. He found Leanne exactly as he had left her, except she was no longer mending her dress. She was standing by the single window, peering out, gunner at her side. She turned as he entered, her eyes searching his face. "You saw him," she said. "I did." He dropped the sack of supplies on the table. "He is not pleased." "He will not let it be," she said, her voice certain. She came to the table and began to unpack the supplies, her movements efficient. When she found the tin of tea, she paused. She looked at it, then up at him. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. It was a small thing, a tin of tea, but it was a recognition of her, a gesture that said she was more than a temporary burden. That night, the largest storm hit. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and snow swirled so thickly it erased the world beyond the cabin walls. They were sealed in, an island in a sea of white. The forced proximity, which should have been awkward, instead settled into a comfortable quiet. They ate their stew in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scream of the wind. After they had eaten, Leanne did something unexpected. She took a charred stick from the hearth and, on a clean patch of the wooden floor, she began to draw. At first, Silas thought she was just sketching, but soon he saw a pattern emerge. It was a map. Not of a place, but of a process. Lines and symbols he did not recognize. "What is this?" he asked, leaning forward. "This is what he wanted," she said, her voice low. "This is what I brought." She pointed with the stick to a series of symbols. "This is the sign for a deep spring, where the willow trees grow with no surface water. My family, they knew how to find water where the land was dry." She continued to draw, her hand moving with a confidence that surprised him. She drew channels, reservoirs, and sluice gates. It was a complex and beautiful system for irrigation, for capturing snowmelt and diverting underground springs to turn arid land green. Silas looked at the drawing, then at the woman. He was beginning to understand. Sterling hadn't just wanted a bride. He had heard a rumor, perhaps, of a family in California with a unique and valuable skill. He had imported Leanne not for her beauty, but for her knowledge. "He has a piece of land," Silas said, the pieces clicking into place. "North of here. Dry as a bone. But there's talk of a silver lode running under it. He can't work a mine without water." Leanne nodded. "He showed me the deed." "The map?" "He demanded I tell him where the water was. How to get it." "I would not." "Why?" Silas asked. "It would have saved you." She looked up at him, and the steel was back in her eyes, sharp and bright. "This knowledge is from my ancestors. It is not for a man who beats his horses and calls a woman a cargo, it is for land that is respected. For a person who is respected." She had refused him. And in his arrogant fury, Sterling had cast her out, believing she was useless without her secret. He had made a colossal miscalculation. He had thrown away the key because he could not bully the lock open. Leanne reached into a small, embroidered pouch she had kept with her. She pulled out a folded piece of rice paper, its edges worn soft. She unfolded it carefully. It was covered in the same elegant, precise script as her drawing on the floor. It was her family's legacy, a detailed treatise on the art of finding and managing water. "He tried to take this," she said. "I would not let him." The wind howled, pressing against the cabin. But the real storm was not outside. It was in the quiet space between them, in the weight of the secret she had just shared. It was a secret that could make a man rich, or it could get them both killed. The sound that came next was not the wind. It was the crunch of boots in the snow, close to the cabin. Gunnar was on his feet in an instant, a low, rumbling growl starting deep in his chest. They were no longer alone. Silas moved instantly, grabbing his rifle from its pegs on the wall. He motioned for Leanne to get away from the window, to move to the far corner of the cabin, behind the woodpile. The crunching stopped. There was a moment of absolute silence, broken only by Gunnar's growl and the frantic beating of his own heart. "Blackwood," a voice shouted from the darkness. It was Peterson, Sterling's man. "We know she's in there. Sterling wants his property back." They were not shouting about Leanne. Silas knew it with a sudden, chilling certainty. Sterling had realized his mistake. He had figured out that the paper, the knowledge, was the real prize. He had sent his men not to retrieve a discarded bride, but to steal a treasure. "She's not property," Silas shouted back, his voice tight. "And you're on my land. Get off it." "Don't be a fool, Blackwood," another voice yelled. There were at least two of them. "He'll pay you for your trouble. Just send her out. And the paper she's carrying." There it was. Leanne, crouched in the corner, looked at him, her eyes wide. She clutched the small pouch to her chest. "Last chance!" Peterson yelled. A gunshot exploded, the bullet thudding into the log wall just beside the door. It was a warning. The next one would not be. Silas looked at Leanne. He saw the fear in her face, but he also saw the same unbending will he had seen before. She would die before she gave them that paper. And he realized, in that moment, that he would die before he let them take it from her. This was no longer about offering shelter from a storm. It was about choosing a side. He thought fast, his mind racing over the landscape he knew as well as his own hand. The cabin was built on a slight rise, with a steep, wooded ridge behind it. The snow on that ridge was deep and heavy, a winter's worth of accumulation resting precariously on the slope. An idea, desperate and dangerous, took root. "Leanne," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The back window. Can you climb out?" She nodded. "Go. Get into the trees behind the cabin. Stay low and don't make a sound. When you hear the big noise, get as far up the ridge as you can." "What are you going to do?" she whispered. "I'm going to make it so they can't follow," he said. He gave her a hard look. "Go. Now." She hesitated for only a second, then squeezed his arm. It was a brief, firm touch, a gesture of trust and alliance. Then she was gone, slipping like a shadow toward the small window at the back of the cabin. Silas waited until he heard the softest of thuds as she landed in the snow outside. He took a deep breath, cocked the rifle, and moved to the front door. He could hear the men talking, getting impatient. The time for negotiation was over. He flung the door open and fired a single shot into the darkness, high over their heads. "You wanted my attention," he roared into the swirling snow. "You have it!" As expected, they returned fire. 2 shots splintered the door frame where his head had been a moment before. He dropped to the floor, crawling toward the side window that faced the ridge. He could hear them advancing, confident now that they had him pinned down. He risked a glance. They were moving around the side of the cabin, trying to flank him, their bodies dark shapes against the snow. They were positioning themselves directly in the path he needed. He pushed the side window open a crack. The cold air was like a slap. He rested the rifle barrel on the sill, aiming not at the men, but far above them, at a specific point on the ridge. It was a spot he'd noted for years, a cornice of snow that overhung a steep, rocky face. A place where the balance was delicate. He took a steadying breath, the image of Leanne's determined face in his mind. He was not just protecting a guest. He was defending a partner. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was swallowed by a deeper sound, a groan that seemed to come from the mountain itself. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like tearing cloth, the cornice of snow gave way. It started as a trickle, then a cascade, then a roaring, thundering wall of white. It was not a huge avalanche, not big enough to bury the cabin, but it was more than enough. It poured down the gully beside the cabin, a river of snow and ice, blocking the path from the road, burying the area where Peterson and his man stood in a deep, impassable drift. There were shouts of panic, then silence. The path to his ranch was gone. He and Leanne were cut off from the world, but they were safe. When the silence returned, deeper and more profound than before, Silas went to the back window. He saw Leanne, a small figure standing among the pines, looking back at him. He raised a hand, and she raised one in return. He had made his choice. He had severed himself from Covenant Creek and everything it represented to stand with her. The cost was isolation. The prize was a chance. The rest of the winter passed in a cocoon of quiet work. The avalanche had trapped Peterson and his accomplice, who were found shivering and frostbitten a day later by the sheriff, their story of being attacked by Silas Blackwood dismissed as the ravings of fools who got caught in a snowslide. Sterling was furious, but with the pass to the ranch blocked, there was nothing he could do. For Silas and Leanne, the isolation was not a punishment but a gift. With the immediate threat gone, a new dynamic settled between them. Leanne, no longer a frightened refugee, revealed the full scope of her knowledge. Using her rice paper diagrams and charred sticks on the floor, she taught Silas the language of water and land. She showed him how to read the subtle dips and rises of his own property, how to identify the places where the spring melt would pool, and where deep water might lie hidden. They spent the days planning. Silas, who had only ever seen his land as a place to graze cattle, began to see it through her eyes, as a system of possibilities. He had the strength and the practical skill, she had the vision and the intricate knowledge. They were a perfect partnership. He learned a few words of her language. She learned the names of his cattle. They worked. When the spring thaw finally came, melting the wall of snow that had protected them, they were ready. They had spent the last month digging, lining channels with flat stones, and building a small, clever reservoir high in the pasture, exactly where Leanne's drawings had indicated it should be. The day the main flow of meltwater began, they opened the sluice gate they had built. Water, clear and cold, flowed into the channels, spreading out across a dusty, fallow field he had long given up on. It drank greedily, the thirsty soil turning dark and rich. Within 2 weeks, a faint tinge of green appeared. By the end of the month, it was a carpet of lush, new grass. He had more pasture than he knew what to do with. His cattle grew fat. His ranch was transformed. One afternoon in late summer, a rider approached the ranch. It was not Sterling or anyone from Covenant Creek. This man was tall and wore a dusty coat and the badge of a U.S. Marshal. Gunner announced his arrival with a warning bark, but Silas, seeing the badge, called him off. The marshal dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene, the healthy cattle, the neat cabin, and the astonishingly green field fed by a network of irrigation ditches. Silas Blackwood, the marshal asked. I am. My name is Marshal Davies. I'm here about a man named Jasper Sterling. Silas waited. Leanne had come to stand in the doorway of the cabin, her hands holding a basket of vegetables from the small garden she had planted near the house. He's been arrested, Davies continued. Fraudulent mining claims, among other things. Seems he was selling shares in a silver mine that didn't exist because he couldn't get the water to it. During my investigation, your name came up. And his interest in a Chinese woman he brought here. The marshal's gaze shifted to Leanne, then back to Silas. His eyes lingered on the irrigation ditches. Looks to me like he let the Rael treasure slip right through his fingers. Silas looked over at Leanne. She was not the humiliated, freezing woman in a ruined silk dress he had found on the road. She was standing tall on her own land, the architect of their shared prosperity. The simple cotton dress she wore was the color of a poppy, a splash of vibrant life against the green of the world they had built together. Yes, sir, Silas said, a slow smile spreading across his face. I suppose he did. He had offered a stranger shelter from the cold, and in return, she had shown him how to make the desert bloom. They had both been alone, and together, they had found a home.